Keller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This amendment would study the impact on how the United States Postal Service fleet electrification transition would affect our domestic energy production and our environment. A study conducted by the Manhattan Institute showed this transition would increase air pollution when compared to new internal combustion engines. Why is Congress in such a rush to implement this transition that may cost us tremendously and could negatively impact our environment? Additionally, my amendment would require a study on how this transition would affect those charging stations industry. In the charging station industry, they use stations and how they're going to be used. Will these charging stations be made available to the public? Will there be a fee assigned to the usage of the equipment? Lastly, how does the federal government plan on maintaining and modernizing this equipment? Congress should fully understand the economic, environmental consequences this electrification process before appropriating billions of dollars to this project. And here again, I would make the thing. I've heard about all the benefits and why we should be doing this. If we really want to convince the American people that this is the way to go, and we're so sure it is, I think everybody would welcome the study to prove out what everybody's saying. And I think that would go a long way as the representatives of the people of the United States of America to say, hey, look, we've done the study and this is what we should do. It would help us follow the science. So I think it would be a big win for all of us in Congress to show the American people that we're willing to have a transparent process, look at the science of it. And if everybody's so confident that this is going to be that beneficial, then we could all get behind it and support it. So with that, I think that having the study is a benefit to the American people. And I would urge that my colleagues support the common sense approach, and I yield back.
I recognize, gentleman yields back, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I appreciate the gentleman's amendment, but I must oppose it on the grounds that it unnecessarily restricts the inspectors general of the USPS and the GSA in their important work to conduct oversight of the electrification of the federal fleet. The amendment would require an extensive study on the merits of electrification, which has already been thoroughly reviewed and examined many times. For example, in a recent study from Consumer Reports found that the total cost of owning an electric vehicle is roughly $6,000 to $10,000 less than a traditional internal combustion engine vehicle. Another study suggests that electrification of the USPS fleet could save taxpayers $2.9 billion by 2025 and $4.6 billion by 2030. Such studies have led us to where we are today with a clear mandate that we must move forward with electrification of our fleet or risk being left behind in the global race to a more modern, efficient, and sustainable future. The evidence is clear. Electric vehicles are a good investment, not only for the climate, but also for our nation's financial health. We also consulted with the IGs of the Postal Service and GSA, and the amount included in this bill is the amount they told us they need to ensure responsible oversight of the electrification process. Diverting these funds to conduct a wasteful study that has already been done, this is a duplicative process or study they're requiring, would be an irresponsible use of taxpayers' dollars. So I cannot in good conscience support this amendment. Therefore, I respectfully urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. And Mr. Comer from Kentucky, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I strongly support this amendment. The cost of this Green New Deal pet project is much higher than the $7.4 billion, and the American people deserve to know what it will really cost. On postal vehicles specifically, Congress has required the Postal Service to be self-funded since 1971. And if Democrats want the money for electric postal trucks, they should aim to make the Postal Service profitable again. That would be a good first step. I urge my colleagues to support the Keller amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is now recognized. Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to point out, the gentleman from Pennsylvania raises a very thoughtful amendment. However, if you look at the private sector, and every single major auto manufacturer in the country is already going towards electric vehicles for the general population. And as Mr. Keller knows full well, Pennsylvania is actually trying to take the lead on this. They're offering incentives to the citizens of Pennsylvania if they buy an electric vehicle instead of buying a fossil fuel, gasoline or diesel vehicle. So I think it's not necessarily, it's a good amendment. It's just not timely. A lot of this analysis has been done through individual states. I think the public is voting with their feet. You see a huge increase in the purchase of these electric vehicles, even at a time when the charging infrastructure is really de minimis right now around the country. So I think one of the great things about this electrification of the United States Postal Service is it'll put charging stations in every community in America where the Postal Service has a post office, and that only adds to the public-facing aspect of electrification of vehicles in general. So I think there'll be a huge benefit, obviously, in environmental terms, but also in terms of providing an additional service and a utility, in fact, to the American people, the American public, and to the private sector. I think there'll be enormous benefits as well. So I appreciate the spirit in which the gentleman offered his amendment. I just think that it's the timing of it is a couple of decades too late, and I think that electric vehicles have proven themselves, and we should march forward into the future. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde, is now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Clyde.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I would speak in support of this amendment. One of the things that my colleague from Pennsylvania said, Mr. Lynch, was that, and I totally agree with that, in the fact that the government is providing subsidies. So if it would, then why is the government providing subsidies behavior toward a certain end goal that the government desires, not necessarily what the private sector desires? So I would say that if you took the government subsidies away, then you would truly see if this was a good idea or wasn't a good idea. So I think that needs to be studied in the absence of government subsidies. So I would support this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted.
Could I request a recorded vote?
A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 and Committee Rule 5B, proceedings on this amendment are postponed. Who seeks recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Grothman, you have an amendment. Will the clerk report the amendment, please?
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee print offered by Mr. Grothman.
Right. I'd like to bring attention to the $4 million going to OM.
Okay, first of all, without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you much. The amendment does deal with striking the $4 million going to OMB for the Justice 40 initiative. A few points I want to make. First of all, this is more money for bureaucracy. Assuming that we're not spending enough money on some segments of the population, this money is not going for education or medical care or job training. It's going to more bureaucrats, which by itself is a problem. Secondly, it just spends more money at a time that we are broke. I will point out we already spend significant sums of money based on people's income levels, be it nutrition, housing, daycare, education, outright cash programs. You cannot say that our society is not trying to, if money could solve the problem, we are certainly sending money to these areas. And it's not just the individuals we're sending money to. On a state level, Wisconsin, I assume, is fairly typical. We again and again push money at the big urban areas. In Milwaukee, that's Wisconsin. So much money that actually we are spending well more money per capita on our schools and well more money per capita on municipal services than most other areas. And the federal government does the same thing through Title I, that sort of thing. The program, to a certain extent, looks at race. This continues down the policy that President Biden has of trying to divide people, or say when we dole things out, it should be race-based. I think that is not a step in the right direction. As a practical matter, when you begin to send things to individual census tracts or treat one census tract different than the other census tract, what I've seen, it caused developers to look for the so-called nice areas in a census tract, and kind of just distorts the free market in that area. Another problem along those lines. A lot of the Justice 40 initiative is supposed to deal with the supposed pollution problem we have in this country. I want to rattle off some numbers. Between 1980 and 2020, we have 81% less carbon monoxide, 98%. I'm sorry, 98% less lead, 67% less nitrogen dioxide, 33% less ozone, 94% less sulfur dioxide. We are so much cleaner than we were 40 years ago. Meanwhile, insofar as we have a pollution problem in this world, you look like at countries like India, countries like China, countries like Bangladesh. That's where you have big pollution problems. And insofar as we do more to make it difficult to deal with these areas, we are just sending jobs to these other countries overseas that don't have the strong standards that we do. And we're only getting better around here, right? Every time a new power plant is built, every time a new car is purchased, we're cleaner than we were before under current law. So in any event, I feel the $4 million is unnecessary. I'm not in favor of the Justice 40 initiative, and would appreciate it if everybody would vote for the bill. Before I forget, I will say that you can just take a roll call on that. I'm not going to ask for a separate roll call because we had not quite the same bill, but not quite the same amendment, but a similar amendment about 6 amendments ago.
Okay, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Let me strongly reiterate what I said earlier. Anyone who claims that the Justice 40 initiative is unworkable or unnecessary is out of touch with the communities across the country that have suffered generations of environmental racism. Our neighbors and constituents are losing their lives, literally. Our communities are being poisoned. Americans are being left behind. All this tragedy due to our failure to address pollution and our nation's history of concentrating those harms in low-income communities where those with the power don't have to experience it every day. If you don't believe me, I urge you to come to my own district and see the smokestacks concentrated in my district, which has caused the whole area to be called Asthma Alley. We heard testimony from mothers who said they moved to the neighborhood, the air was clean. Now their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren need breathalators to breathe in that particular neighborhood. I urge you to visit the districts of my colleagues, Congresswoman Tlaib, Congresswoman Bush, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. As I said earlier, climate change and pollution kill hundreds of thousands of Americans and cost the US economy an estimated $700 billion each year. And we can take steps to save these lives and prevent this pollution. We need the political will. These staggering costs are concentrated in low income, frontline communities that are overburdened by pollution, but underserved by both government and the private sector. In fact, people of color in the US are over 3 times more likely to breathe the most polluted air. This crisis is the result of generations of poor policy choices, but making better choices now can help to a better future. The success of Justice 40 depends on a coordinated effort across the federal government, which is why we've included the funding that OMB needs to cover its implementation responsibilities. We can fix this. We can strengthen the American economy with a strong approach to environmental justice that fights the climate crisis, creates jobs, and advances racial and economic equity. And most importantly, save lives. That's what the Build Back Better agenda is all about, and we intend to deliver on it. I respectfully urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this amendment and supporting the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative implementation. I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Comer is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I strongly support Mr. Grothman's amendment, this great common sense amendment. We could pass this amendment today and save the taxpayers of America $4 million. That would be a positive story coming out of Congress for once. The Justice 40 initiative is the Democrats' environmental branch of their radical socialist agenda and only serves to separate and divide this country. It will put certain people out of work without replacement jobs, and it's impractical. This kind of pie in the sky policy without demonstrated benefit does not deserve 1 penny of Americans' hard-earned taxpayer dollars. I urge my colleagues to vote yes and strike the funding for the Justice 40 initiative, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no. No.
No,
No.
The noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted. Who
Madam
else
Chairman, I
seeks
have an amendment at
recognition?
the desk.
Okay, who seeks recognition? Mr. Sessions. The clerk will report Mr. Sessions' amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee print offered by Mr. Sessions of Texas.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman from Texas is recognized to explain his amendment.
Madam Chairman, thank you. And I want to, as has been expressed by members of this committee, including our great young leader, Mr. Comer, we greatly acknowledge and are sorry for the storms that are headed not only in the Northeast, but across this country. I saw Chairman Greg Meeks on today as he was talking about this, and the people of my congressional district, and I could say across Texas, offer their prayers of support and knowledge that you're working through something difficult. And for all the people in the Northeast, we want to express our sympathy for you, Madam Chairman. Madam Chairman, today, this amendment is really quite simple. It strikes the section of the text providing $10 million to the District of Columbia for electric vehicles. Washington, D.C. has a surplus budget of more than $500 million at this time. Specifically in 2020, according to multiple reports, news reports, Washington, D.C. was reporting $526 million in surplus. That's more than the entire budget of really congressional districts, many of them across this country. If the elected representatives of Washington, D.C. think the city's government needs electric vehicles, they should use their local tax dollars that they already have to acquire these vehicles. They would know best about what that impact will be, as we have spoken all day about the use of electricity that will draw down the electricity that is available for hospitals and homes and businesses within Washington, D.C. if they're not careful. We, meaning the federal taxpayers and across the country, have already provided many funds to the district, and they should be making this determination. I believe that this will cause a severe impact on the electric generation and use of that by Washington, D.C. And rather than viewing it as a gift, they should have to debate the worthiness of what will happen when these vehicles begin drawing down electricity that was not designed, nor were these power plants designed to take the place of what would be trillions of gallons of gasoline in energy. This will cause a significant impact on the electric generation in Washington, D.C. for those purposes. And so with those 2 points in mind, I would ask that we not give the Washington, D.C. this money for $10 million for them to buy vehicles when they could spend their own money. But Madam Chairman, mostly because they better be responsible for what they're getting ready to do to their constituents when all of a sudden their electrical grid system goes on the blink. And so I think under the terms that we have heard lots of times, we'd like for them to be responsible for their own actions. And I thank you for hearing my amendment, Madam Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair, I seek recognition. This is
The gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I strongly oppose this amendment. I thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, for including $10 million in the committee print for the District of Columbia to purchase electric vehicles and related infrastructure. The DC provision mirrors the provision in the committee print for greening the federal vehicle fleet. The transportation sector is the largest source of greenhouse emissions nationally and the second largest source in the District of Columbia. DC's goal is to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2032 and to be carbon neutral by 2050. To achieve these goals, DC needs more electric vehicles and related infrastructure. DC has thousands of cars and trucks in its fleet ranging from school buses to fire engines to garbage trucks, including 1,200 light-duty gas-powered vehicles. DC has been working to green its fleet and has won awards for its fleet greening efforts. Currently, the district has 168 electric or plug-in hybrids in its fleet. The $10 million would allow DC to replace at least 200 gas-powered vehicles with electric vehicles. There is nothing unusual about Congress appropriating funding directly to the District of Columbia. Each year, Congress appropriates funding directly to DC for matters ranging from elementary, secondary, and higher education to public health and water infrastructure. Congress often uses its power over DC to impose policies on DC that DC does not support. DC supports this $10 million, and I urge a no vote on the amendment.
The gentle lady yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Comer, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I strongly support Mr. Sessions' amendment. Another great amendment to save money. I commend the Republicans for trying to actually save taxpayer dollars today. The District of Columbia does not need electric vehicles, but I'll tell you what the District of Columbia does need. They need a mayor who can do something about the surging crime rates and all the homelessness that's just running rampant through the city. This is a perfect example of why DC does not need to become a state, by the way, Madam Chair. DC complains about it so unfairly treated under the constitutional system designed by our founding fathers, but it never fails to attempt to jump the line in the halls of Congress to get special treatment from the federal government. The District of Columbia government has a budget surplus, as Mr. Sessions mentioned. If the DC council or the mayor want to go buy electric vehicles, they should do so with local funds, not taxpayer dollars from across the country. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? I recognize myself for 5 minutes. This amendment would strike all funding to allow the District of Columbia to purchase more than 200 electric vehicles. Electrifying federal and DC fleets is a critical investment we cannot afford not to make. Our climate is facing unprecedented changes that are destroying lives. Every year, the weather becomes more and more extreme and more lives are lost in the devastating weather events that we just experienced last night in New York and New Jersey and Louisiana. Reducing our reliance on fossil fuels will help reduce the impact humans are having on climate change. As we discussed at length today, beyond the proven environmental benefits, electric vehicles yield economic benefits in the long run. The evidence is clear. Electric vehicles are a good investment, not only for the climate, but also for our nation's financial future. Maximizing the amount of electrified vehicles on the road is a priority. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Raskin, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to say a word also on behalf of treating the people of DC as worthy of this investment, which of course they are. And this investment is an investment in everybody because we need to move to an electric fleet in order to reduce the calamitous consequences of the carbon emissions that are wrecking our climate system with unprecedented forest fires in the West, unprecedented drought in the Midwest, incredible flooding on the East Coast, a climate system that has been completely destabilized. And we've got to get serious about this and again, remove it from the realm of just, partisan football. I assume Congresswoman Norton is showing her general good manners, but I think that we should be outraged on her part that anyone would use this as an opportunity to take a shot at the people of Washington, D.C., who are asking for nothing more than what the people of the rest of the country have, which is statehood, political equality, and the ability to govern themselves and to be represented on an equal basis in the U.S. Senate and in the U.S. House. So if their budget goes down, I hear some of my colleagues say they don't deserve statehood because they can't manage it. If their budget goes up and they've got a big surplus because they're well managed, then they say, well, let's not treat them equally and make federal investments in the people of DC. Stop treating them like strangers to American democracy. That's 713,000 tax-paying, draftable American citizens, many thousands of them we've seen in this committee through testimony, have served the country in every war that America's ever had, going back to the American Revolution. And I think any of us, I know I certainly would take umbrage if people disrespected my constituents in that way. So I think that we should absolutely reject this amendment, and we should expect that all Americans will be treated fairly. I also want to take the opportunity, Madam Chair, just to defend myself for a moment, I think a couple of my colleagues invoked the role that I had in the not botched but successful, the most successful bipartisan impeachment of a president of the United States in American history. There have been 4 presidential impeachments, one of Andrew Johnson for alleged violation of the Tenure in Office Act, one of Bill Clinton for lying about sex, the first one of Donald Trump for the Ukraine shakedown and trying to get President Zelensky, who was in town yesterday, to falsely claim that Joe Biden was under criminal investigation in Ukraine. And the final one, and the most bipartisan impeachment, was of Donald Trump for inciting a violent insurrection against the Congress of the United States and against Vice President Pence, whose name was chanted repeatedly by hundreds or thousands of people saying, "Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence." And we demonstrated overwhelmingly and conclusively that Donald Trump incited that violent insurrection with his calls to stop the steal and go and fight like hell or you won't have a country anymore and so on. And I defend myself in some detail, Madam Chair, just because I've noticed that over the last few days, the terrorist insurrectionists, and here I'm using the terminology of the police officers who fought them for 5 or 6 hours, and these officers, more than 140 of them, ended up wounded and injured, including loss of fingers, eyes gouged, traumatic brain injury, and so on. The terrorist insurrectionists who attacked us have been praising the Taliban, the very people who some of our colleagues are saying should come back to Washington and who are claiming are political prisoners are out there celebrating the victory of the Taliban. And of course, it makes sense because they are equally opposed to women's reproductive freedom. They are equally opposed to gay rights, and they view this as some kind of great victory against the United States government, the same people who attacked us on January 6th. So I am very proud of the role I got to play in the impeachment of the first American president to incite a violent insurrection against his own government. And I'm also very proud to stand up against religious fanaticism and terrorism all over the world, whether it's in Afghanistan or whether it comes to our own doorstep. I yield back to you, Madam Chair.
It's back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Keller, you are now recognized. Mr. Keller?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank you for recognizing me. And I've been listening to the debate over this amendment, and I just think that when I looked at the bill, I didn't see that we were buying electric vehicles for any other state or any other city in the country. So I think this, we talk about equity and we talk about all those other things on the other side of the aisle. I would just think that Washington, D.C. should be treated just like any other political subdivision, any other state. We're not buying electric vehicles for Philadelphia. We're not buying them for Pittsburgh. We're not buying them for Sunbury, Pennsylvania, or Williamsport, where my constituents are. I don't think we should be buying them for any one city. So I would make that point, and I yield back. Thanks.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, is now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Biggs.
Move to strike the last word.
Okay, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, I hesitate here because I don't want to take the bait of my colleague from Maryland, but he raised so many issues that I think are so wrong, obviously. I remember not too long ago having a committee hearing, I thought he might have been there, where the director of the FBI came in. And I've been critical of the director of the FBI from time to time, but he was asked a couple of pointed questions. Number one, was this an insurrection? And he said, no, this was not what I don't want to say, because I can't give you the quote, I'm going to paraphrase. He said, I have to use legal terms, and this does not qualify as an insurrection. When he talked about the people who were there on January 6th, he said there were 3 types of people there. There was by far the biggest crowd were peaceful but rowdy. The second group are people who had technical violations. They entered places they shouldn't have been. And that was a much, much smaller group. And many of them have been arrested for technical violations, trespass, et cetera. And then the third thing would be you actually had a small group of people that were violent and rioting, and ultimately many of them have been arrested. So, and then nobody on our side of the aisle has ever said they shouldn't have been, that they should have been there. That indeed, if you were violent, et cetera, and you're violating the laws, you have to suffer the consequences of violating those laws. That's what we have said. The FBI recently put out a report saying, apparently, that they didn't find collusion or a big insurrection, an organized insurrection, the way that my colleague has just characterized it. I will let him go on because he's part of the group of my colleagues across the aisle who, even after the Mueller report came out, still insist on some kind of Russian hoax, and that's a problem. But back to the Sessions Amendment, I think Mr. Keller made the wise point. If you're going to claim that this is all to be done in equity, then you would be wanting to spend money on every community in the country to provide them with electric vehicles. And of course, somebody would, at least, and it'd be me and others, I would hope, would say, we simply can't afford that, nor can we afford this. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed
Aye.
say no. No.
Oh,
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it and the amendment is not adopted.
Madam Chairman, I'd ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered and pursuant to Clause 2 of Rules 11, Committee Rule 5B, proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Okay, who now seeks recognition?